moment in time. Alrighty then. Amidst all the distractions. All right. Amidst all the distractions of this wild and wicked world, we are allowed a glimpse at times into the slow, unfolding passages of the scrolls of time. The scrolls of time, as they are revealed in the mythic annals of thought. Now, let me put it this way to start off with. Just to establish some parameters. So it could be said that when we're speaking of the presence of the god Hermes in the flowing onward of our poetic lines of thought, that what we mean to do is to follow the threads of our own associations so that we can come to a place where we can open the door of meaning. Or as William Blake put it, I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball, and it will lead you to Jerusalem's gate, built into Jerusalem's wall. So it's a matter of just finding just the slightest, the thinnest thread, where the very place where the attention, the human energy of attention, emerges from consciousness, to study the successions of time and the images of the successions of time, so that each further unfolding is revealed as a kind of a world. Now, numbers do this one way. Numbers do this in many ways, actually. And histories do this in many ways. And poems do this in certain particular ways. And it is down along those lines of sight that we aim to orient our vision. So, this is a poem called Cognitive. For the painter, the world body is established through paint. For the painter, the world body is established through paint. For the poet, the world body is established through myth. The Olympian is where titanic leftover factors carry themselves along in dramatic spherical terms, subjected to suppositions of the endless laity. A soapbox opera with Etruscan rain dances, made from backs of pickup trucks, by workers of the hollow willow wands. 'Neath the frozen stars of my lord Mepham, with many a needful offering at the foot of piles of stones at world boundaries, where invisible people commune with each other in Hyperborean chambers of the unridden Northwest Passage. Of the unridden Northwest Passage, or could it be the unriddled Northwest Passage? These are open and ambiguous questions as we enter the world of Hermes, following the signs of Hermes, which are oh so very often misdirections. For in the very beginning, when we contemplate the way that Hermes has appeared before our poetic imagination, when we think about that, we begin to see the origins of abstract art, placed by those with access to the materials at hand out of the needs of their own, as they went about doing what they do and what they did along the roads of the world. They left signs. They left signs as they traveled. They left piles of stones along significant places in the trail as they walked along. For example, where there were crossroads, they, as a sign both that they were there and had passed along that way, and also as an indicator to other travelers who would follow along in their footsteps, and as perhaps a signal or a message to those who would come from other places along the unknown directions that the roads they had not walked crossed with their own road. And they put stones there. One traveler would place a stone, another traveler would see a preponderance of stones and place another stone there, and another traveler would. Eventually, there were these piles of stones placed at crossroads. Sometimes they are called cairns, Carins. For some reason now, we also refer to them as Hermes. And there's a reason for that. Because this is also what mythology does. Paint provides the body of the world for the painter. For example, when Leonardo da Vinci painted the Virgin and Saint Anne and the child in the arms of the Virgin, he painted the background, the rocks, the sea, the blue light, which was so earthly and unearthly at the same time, in the background. But he also was just simply conveying or arraying the terms of his craft as a painter, a world created through paint, through color, through foreground, through background, through perspective. It is in the same way that the poet builds a world, only for the poet, the world, the body of the world, the body of the experienced world is built with the energy of myth, with the energy and the basic structural, building elements of myth. And this is how the poet builds the world. For it is in myth that a world is built in terms of the inner energy of the word. It is in such terms, then, that we begin to consider and perhaps, hopefully, begin to understand the nature of some of the words that have fascinated us so much as human beings down through the ages. For example, the divinities, the gods, the goddesses, and the things that they did. For it is one thing to conceive of a god as a formless power, as a numinosity, as a glowing or a singular intuition or sensation or feeling or understanding or thought. It is one thing to have it appear to one. And such an energy or such an an inspiration or such a phenomenon in consciousness often dares to overflow its boundaries and leap out into the world of words, or into the world of thought, or into the world of images. And in order to do so, or in doing so, this original motion or this original impetus of this motion toward meaning appears in the eye of the mind or the ears of the soul as, a deed or an event. So it's one thing for the gods to be gods. And what does that mean? Something is required for the completion of that equation, and that is the deeds of the gods. The deeds of the gods, and these become the myths. They are put into words as deeds of the gods. Sometimes as words and sometimes as depictions upon, frescoes, upon temple walls or upon vases. Sometimes upon, messages left here and there. And they are often pictorial images of the deeds of the gods, of actual happenstances. But then there is that which makes the gods gods, which only appears to human consciousness as understanding. And how do you put that into words? How do you put that into the normal conveyances? Well, you don't. Instead, you revisit the sources of what originally elicited your attention. And then you bring your consciousness back into it again. And then these other elements kind of unfold. On and on and on. And it is only because myth is myth that it appears to human consciousness in this way. But this very way of description is actually a gift of the god Hermes. For he is the god of certain forms of communication. And we have to consider that. And he is the god of certain ways of expressing meaning through this human invention called the alphabet, which actually Hermes himself did assist the Therai, the Therai, who were these illuminated this trio of sisters who helped to raise Apollo. And they taught Apollo in Apollo's infancy long before Hermes was born. They taught Apollo they brought Apollo the gifts of prophecy and the gifts of augury, the Therai, 3 of them. And the mythology also gives us other forms of 3, the 3 fates. The 3 fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. And their medium, the 3 fates, believe it or not, is thread. For they are the spinners of the destiny, of the life course of each human being. Clotho spins and produces. Lachesis draws out and measures. And Atropos, with her scissors, she snips and brings things that have begun to an end. And this gives us a pattern of weaving, and these are the 3 fates. So these things are ways in which the gods, let's just playfully say it, these images are ways in which the gods think. Or maybe they're ways in which we identify with what the gods would think if we could understand the ways of the gods. These are eternal kind of like, draws upon our attention. Well, and yet we owe it to Hermes for just the gift of being able to speak of it this way. It is said that Hermes drew out from the threads given to him by the other elements of the world and the worlds and the other gods, and by studying the tracks of the animals upon the impressions of the animal feet upon the muddy banks of the Nile River and other rivers, and the tracks of the birds and the tracks of other creatures, that from that he abstracted this vast constellation of meaning which we call the alphabet. The alphabet, where different elements can be combined into other elements which form Words which, draw our mind onward and onward into further and further realms of meaning. These seem to have all come to us from the mind of Hermes, from the mind of the god. But isn't it true, and isn't it rather funny, that each of the gods brings to us a kind of a world of their own and a cosmos of their own, which makes sense in its own way, which captivates us enough to build into time successions of formal expression which continue to speak of this mysterious nature which has first appeared at the primordial beginnings. Well, it is Hermes that allows us to speak of it this way. And how could that be that Hermes would do this? We have to consider, before we consider the events that constitute, the span of his life, we have to consider what it is within the mind or minds of all of the gods that is one common kind of theme or manifestation of the need to embody what is in common with all of the gods and all of the goddesses. Now, some would say, schooled in the mythology, would say, oh, clearly it is power, the need for power, because the gods vying for power and influence in whatever ways that they do provide us with the materials of the dramas, by which we remember them. We remember them by means of the dramas of their events, of the circumstances and happenings, of the things that they did. We remember it, and it is memorable because it takes the form of drama. And so they become stories that we tell. And the more we tell them, the more associational meanings are accrued. And the more we tell them, the more the people who hear them and ponder them and consider them deeply, the more inspirational energies gather around them. The more then the energy of meaning continues to manifest as part of the inheritance given by time and space to human consciousness for us to make use of in this wild and wicked world. Therefore, it behooves us to pay attention to the mythologies. And it is Hermes who gives us the gift to be able to speak of it this way. So, somewhat repetitively, to say again that before we speak of his events and the circumstances of his life, we have to speak of what was the inspiration or the impetus in the minds of the gods. And what was it that was driving all of these connections to occur, across the different worlds and primordial cosmoses as they were coming into being? Well, it was the drive to express the invisible, the drive, the urge, the response to an inner need to express some notion of form that would continue to provide understanding for those beyond the time when the form is first created. From the mind of the gods, this was the first primordial kind of impulse from the mind of the gods. And they were as misguided as we human beings are in the ways that they expressed it, usually in the drive for power or, dominion or domination, sometimes in acts of extravagant and unique generosity. The gods' bounty would overflow into the world of the human beings and give them another way to understand the energies of the gods. I'm speaking very generally now, of course. But it was something in Zeus, in a cave, in somewhere on the slopes of Mount Kylene, in the ancient land of Arcadia, in the primordial land of Arcadia, And Maya was the inhabitant of that cave. But perhaps it was more than a cave. Perhaps it was a beautiful place, a luxurious place, because it is said that Maya, I'm talking about the mother of Hermes, Maya's father was Atlas, the being who holds the world on his shoulders, a pre-Olympian personage. So Maya is descended from a pre-Olympian world, whereas Zeus, an Olympian, though he too is descended from a pre-Olympian world, but the forms through which he has passed to become who he is, Zeus, compel him to obey the demands of the need to express the new world of the Olympians. So Zeus is under the necessity to extend and draw out further the inner meaning of this Olympian form of being which is newly come upon the world. Whereas Maya, well, the stories tell us so many things, and the stories hold in them this kind of like contradictory notion. You know, it's like the reader, the contemplator knows that it can have it both ways at once, that Maya is both an avatar of a pre-Olympian world. At the same time, Maya is one who is detached from the power hungers and the power dramas of all the gods, even as they have begun to appear. And Maya lives detached and alone to herself in a cave in Arcadia. This is the mother of Hermes, in a cave in Arcadia. Someday there will come someone who will give us the inner sense of the terrain of Arcadia, and who will reach into the background of the memory of Maya, into the background of the memory of Zeus, into the deep and primordial memory of the people who lived in Arcadia, and how they emerged into consciousness and began to move in the world. Before the Titanic era, before the Olympian era, they were just people, and they were living their lives, and they were in a lot of places. Among the places were Arcadia. In Arcadia, the mountain, Mount Selene, and they moved in the world, and they moved amongst each other, and they were pastoralists, and they were nomads, and they were hunter-gatherers. They were all these forms of human understanding and interaction and social organization. But they moved between all these other places, and it was so basic to the nature of their being to move along these places that they followed the track of the animals. The animals knew the way to go, and they followed the track of the animals and adapted the trails and the roads according to their own needs. And at times when they came to places where they knew others had been, they lifted stones and they placed them on the ground as markers, and others who came along lifted stones and placed them on the ground as markers, and by the mounds of stones grew larger and had more and more characteristic shapes representing the terrain around them, cairns, or as I mentioned, Hermes, piles of stones at crossroads. Well, the original abstract art, these Hermes were. The original abstract art. Because compare them, what can you compare them to? Well, they are markers of passage. They are markers of passage, but they are also markers of an awareness or an understanding of that which has guided their passage. And there is some inner need to commemorate that as an external sign upon the land. And so they leave these piles of stones. The original abstract art, because what you can compare them to are temples. You can compare cairns and Hermes and piles of stones left at crossroads by travelers to mark their way and to guide others and to just provide some kind of communicative energy to others whom they do not see. You can think of them as counterparts to temples. Temples are also piles of stone, in a way, but they are structures which can be entered into. And inside of temples, one can abstract themselves from external surroundings and inhabit the space designated as sacred to the god who is the presiding deity of such a temple. And they're inside there, within such a place, commune with the god. Whereas piles of stones along the side of the road, no one lives there. You cannot live in a pile of stones. It's something that you leave as you go on your way. And you keep your understanding of the significance of that place in your memory. And you have communicated your perception of the significance of that place by leaving a stone there. It's a cognitive kind of art. It's not something that you go inside of, and it changes your external surroundings so much that your consciousness is transfigured into a sense of the God who is the presiding deity of that place. No, a pile of stones is something that you leave as a marker, something that is a sign of a reality that is not explicitly or specifically expressed in that place, rather just simply a sign to communicate. So what cairns are, what Hermes are, there are ways, they are the ways, perhaps the original ways, that the people communicated to others whom they would not see. The ways that the people communicated to others that they would not see, whose language they did not speak, who would come after them, and who knows when, or how many of them, or for what purposes, or for what motives, or what were they carrying with them, or where were they going. These were signs to people in this transformative human journey. And it's interesting, too. What would you do then with this original abstract art, a pile of stones? You would draw from it a specific art form. There's a kind of sculpture that is called a herm, or perhaps I should say it's a kind of design, a herm. And all it is really, it does mean, the word does mean a pile of stones left at crossroads and other places, but it also means a kind of just a rectangular stony obelisk, or a rectangular stony structure upon which you mount oftentimes a bust, a face or a head upon a rectangular stone. And that is a kind of sculpture that is called a herm. It is a face supported by a vertical rectangle. A statement in and of itself, an abstract support and a visible, humanly recognizable form atop it. And the original Hermes were, oftentimes, they were in the realm of Hermes. Hermes' face appears on many of these ancient Hermes. But it's whole other realm of understanding. Sometimes one Herm can support two faces, Hermes and Aphrodite, Hermes and Athena. Hermes already, through these art forms, through these creations of human inspiration, is making it possible for human beings to see his face in connection or juxtaposed along with other faces of other gods in one particular structure. This is poetically significant. This is something that you could strive to capture in words again and again and again. And maybe 1,000 years from now, someone will actually achieve what was first suggested in this kind of like quasi-abstract kind of like form created by anonymous human beings thousands of years ago. It is Hermes that allows us to think of things in this way. So, Hermes, the child of Maya, the child of Zeus. Zeus, in his mad desire to extend this Olympian inspiration in all these living forms, incorporating and including and bringing into the Olympian world all these pre-Olympian kind of elements. This is what is represented by the union of Zeus and Maya. On the fourth day of, some say the fourth month, in springtime, and the child Hermes is born from this divine yet illicit union. And the child Hermes is born, the infant Hermes is born to Maya in a cave. And she places him in a cradle, which she hangs from a hook on the wall. And the first morning of his birth, it is said. Imagine the abstraction of this. This is abstract art, actually. This is abstract art stepping out of its pile of stones manifestation. This is abstract art stepping out of that and stepping into a sense of mythical time. Because it is, we enjoy or we understand the meaning of it in an abstract way when we think about the fact that Hermes, on the very day he was born, on the very morning he was born, on the very morning he was placed as an infant in a cradle and hanging from a cave wall, on the very first morning of his birth, he stepped away from this. He stepped away from the cradle in which he was supposed to be sleeping as an infant, and he stepped upon the earth. He stepped upon the earth, and he began to walk out the entrance to the cave where he was supposed to be sleeping. And his mother Maya did not know that infants could do such a thing, so she slept on. She slumbered on. The infant Hermes, or the child god, stepped out of his cradle and stepped onto the earth and stepped out of the threshold of the cave, the ancient poets tell us, and saw another earthly creature, or an earthly creature, in the way that perhaps, he was unearthly himself, or perhaps he is earthly. I do not know. I cannot tell you if a mythical god is earthly or unearthly. I don't know if I can answer that, especially when I consider a divine being looking upon a terrestrial creature that Hermes looked upon at the threshold of his cave in the morning of his birth, when he stepped out surreptitiously and looked down upon the ground and saw there eating on the threshold of the cave, eating grass, a turtle. There was a turtle eating grass at the threshold of the cave. And Hermes looked down, and this is the first time we understand of Hermes as speaking. He speaks to the turtle. He speaks of the turtle's kaleidoscopic shell. Does he praise the turtle? You could draw praise from that, but I wonder if it's not so much that he praises the turtle, but that he greets the turtle with a primordial voice. And he sees the turtle, but he sees through the turtle with, the merciless relentlessness of the god. But there's something more. When I say he sees through the turtle with the merciless relentlessness of a god, what I mean to say is that he sees the use of the turtle. He sees to what purpose he will put the structure of the turtle to fulfill his own godly inspiration. He sees through the turtle in that way. But he also sees the turtle in its own original being, and he acknowledges the beauty and the good fortune. he acknowledges the good fortune of seeing the turtle in this way. And then he begins to heap flattery and praise upon the turtle. And he remarks what a fortunate day it is to see such a turtle. And he promises the turtle that he will take good care of the turtle. He picks up the turtle and he brings the turtle inside the cave, not too far inside the cave because he doesn't want to wake up his mother. But then the turtle sacrifices its life to the needs of the god. And Hermes steps out of the cave once more, holding the shell of the turtle. And then Hermes begins to wonder about the resonation, the concavity of the inner shell of this turtle. And he begins to think that maybe he will do something with this turtle. And oh, the ambiguities abound, because he needs another element to make of the shell of this turtle the instrument by which he will further the extension of his sound into the world. Was it that? Was it the desire to have strings to string across the shell of the turtle to make the original musical instrument, the lyre, the guitar? Was it that impelled Hermes to go out upon the roads of the world, looking for some kind of trouble, looking for some kind of mischief, looking for some kind of way to draw upon the bounties of the world given by the gods in order to take advantage of it in some way, to give it a certain turn or a certain twist in the interest of what? Ingenuity, to make something into something else entirely? Was it that impelled Hermes to walk out of the cave and to go along the roads of the world? Was it that impelled Hermes to stop on the very first day, on the very first morning of his birth, to stop at a meadow and see a herd of cattle? A herd of cattle belonging to who? Well, was Hermes thinking of who the cattle might have belonged to when he decided that he wanted them for his own? Well, was Hermes thinking of the consequences of his deed and his act and the boundaries over which he was stepping when he guided the cattle out of their pasture, out of their meadow, onto the road down which he had been walking, and began to lead them farther along back the way that he had come back to his own home? Was it a desire? Was it greed? Was it self-importance that prompted Hermes to basically steal these cattle? By the way, these cattle belonged to Apollo. They were the cattle of the sun, belonging to Apollo. And Hermes, on the first morning of his birth, gathered these cattle together and stole them, drove them away, and drove them back to his home. What a titanic act that is. Now, in pre-Olympian times, we already understand most of the impetus of these events, like the word greed. We already understand from pre-Olympian times, from the time of the Titanic age. They wanted what they wanted and they took what they took. And if they were prevented, they were prevented. And if they were not, then they took. And so we understand this as primordial beings seeking for power and giving us inklings of all these just, stupendous and irrational yet implacable happenings that are so overwhelm us. Is Hermes doing something like that? Well, insofar as it is theft, he is doing that. This mirrors the actions of the people, the nomadic people of that time. They were nomadic herdsmen, pastoralists, but it was kind of accepted at the edges of the boundaries of the individual territories of each kind of like family gathering and village gathering, that there would be like some kind of crossing of boundaries and advantageous activities, including like the stealing of cattle from other family groups. This is how This is how pastoral societies began to accrue more and more of the means of exchange and the elements of value, and in by hook and by crook, contributing to the layers of civilization that provide us with so much material to contemplate now at this point in the long, strange journey of the human being. Was it this that motivated Hermes, much like the Titanic days? Yes, it was that. Sure, we understand it in a dramatic sense, but there was something more that was happening before our very eyes as an event, and this is what it is. Hermes, as one of his very first actions, he gathered the cattle together, he led them to the road, he led them down the road, but he added something extra, something he dreamed up out of the materials at hand, out of oak bark, out of chunks of trees, out of twine made of braided weeds and fibers of plants. He created or invented crazy shoes for the hooves of the stolen cattle. He tied around the hooves of all the cattle clusters and chunks of oak bark that made it seem that with every step each cow took with each of its 4 hooves, that the hoof prints left seemed to point the other direction. Hermes created an instrument of misdirection. Hermes created a way to mislead those who would follow the tracks and the traces of the original act that he was committing. Hermes dressed the hooves of each cow in shoes that made it seem like the cow was going the opposite direction it was going. What a crazy thing to do. What a crazy trace to leave. It is Hermes' action in doing this that enables us to talk about it now, and how weird that is. And whatever that means, well, maybe we'll find out, or maybe we'll just kind of come to the edge of it as a mystery. But Hermes guided the cattle down the road, but to one who would follow their tracks, it would be utterly contradictory, because they seemed to be going in a way that they did not. What a thing to do. What a thing that met the eye of Apollo. When Apollo happened upon the scene sometime later, Apollo, impetuous, entitled, totally sure of his own power, looked into the meadow where his cattle were, and they were gone. Who stole my cattle? Who stole my cattle? I will find out. And then he went to the road, and he saw the tracks. Oh, I will follow the tracks that the culprit left. But they led him repeatedly. Who knows how many times. They led him repeatedly back to the pasture from which they originally been. Apollo was dumbfounded. He did not know what to think. Now, Apollo, at this time, he had a certain grudge against crows for various reasons, which I won't go into. But the crows in the trees seemed to perch upon the branches, and they seemed to be telling him something that he could not understand. They seemed to be saying something about the cattle being stolen and who had done it, but there was something in the way that the crows were talking that caused Apollo to completely reject what they were saying. And yet at the same time, he could not deny the fact that the tracks made no sense. So Apollo went to Silenus and the satyrs, forest-dwelling demigods, hooved beings themselves, actually, goat from the waist down and human being from the waist up. And he enlisted their help, asking them to help him find where his cattle had gone. And it was the satyrs who roved searching for the cattle through the vales of Arcadia. And they came to the cave. And they were going past the cave. Seems like they heard music coming from inside the cave. They stopped, these satyrs. And from out of the cave came another nymph, not Maya, but Selene. Selene, who perhaps is related to Maya. Perhaps Selene was kind of maybe assisting Maya in the rearing of not only Hermes, but other youngsters that would be around, nymphs and various beings and demigods. But it was Selene who told the satyrs, the music that you hear comes from inside the cave. Have you heard? Have you heard about Maya's child? Why, incredible child he is. He invents his own musical instruments. And the satyrs, they heard the music playing from inside the cave. It was strange, unearthly music, pluck, 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 coming from like different frequencies of sound. I don't know how interested they were in music at that time, but they could recognize that something unusual was happening. But then they also, these satyrs, saw another sign. The other sign was there was signs, burnt embers, burnt coals upon the ground, and bones, and grease stains. There were signs of a sacrifice outside the cave. And they, put two and two together in their minds. They wondered, were cattle sacrificed here? Could it be that the cattle that were stolen by Apollo, who has asked us to find out where these cattle went, could it be that those burnt offering remnants over yonder are signs of what was once the cattle of Apollo? And could it be that the music coming from inside the cave is connected to this? What could this mean? And so they began to question Selene, perhaps really bluntly. We are looking for stolen cattle. We see signs of stolen cattle out there. We hear strange sounds, could be described as music, coming from inside the cave. But we wonder now, if it's strings being plucked, from where have those plucked strings come? Could it be cow gut? And if it's cow gut strings being plucked, which make these musical sounds, could that be cattle gut strings taken from the cattle of Apollo? And they asked Selene this, or they intimated it in one way or another. And Selene, she took offense. Are you accusing this newborn child of theft? Oh, and they were at loggerheads, as the divine beings so often are. We would not be telling their stories now if they weren't at these loggerheads. And I, for one, am grateful that I wasn't there. I would have loved to have been there to watch, but I don't want to have been involved, because the contradiction of the aims and the events and it can be very unpleasant, no doubt about it, but memorable for that reason. But just at that moment, Apollo arrived. Apollo, he had taken heart of the way the crows were talking to him, couldn't understand exactly what they were saying, or he couldn't accept what they were saying. But then he followed a long-legged wading bird, perhaps a heron of some kind, which led him to the very same place where Selene, or where Kylene and the satyrs were having their conflicted argument. And Apollo arrived. And Apollo looked at the burnt embers, the burnt coals, and the bones upon the ground. And he heard the music coming from inside. He knew something was going on in there. And I believe, actually, he knew this was the cave, the dwelling of his cousin Maya. You know, they're all related. That's the strange secret of all these gods and demi-beings. They're all related. But Apollo just strode into the cave with the presumption of a god, of the specific god he was, and the specific presumption of what motivated his actions. He strode into the cave, and his footsteps perhaps woke up Maya, or maybe Maya was already awake. And Apollo looked at Maya. Maya looked at Apollo. One of them said to the other, "Greetings, cousin." Perhaps they both said it at the same time. "Greetings, cousin." They greeted each other. Apollo spoke. "Oh, well, I see by there's an occupant in those swaddling clothes in that cradle on the cave wall. May I congratulate you on the birth of your son? I've heard news about this upon Olympus." And Maya began to speak of, "Oh, yes, Hermes, I call him. He is just born today. But look, he makes his own toys. Look at what he's playing with now. He's made a musical instrument. Listen to what he's singing." And Apollo would have none of it. Apollo said, "I'm looking for my stolen cattle. I see that instrument has been made by cow gut. I see signs of burnt offerings of cattle outside this very cave." Maya So where have my cattle gone? And they began to exchange words with each other. Harsh words, perhaps, cross words. But then the voice of Hermes came out of the swaddling clothes on the cave wall. "Oh, mother, may I speak?" They both looked. Hermes peeked out of his swaddling clothes. He had been pretending to be asleep the whole time. He stepped out, and once more, as he'd done before with nobody knowing it, he stepped onto the ground, and he said, "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Hermes. I am an innocent child." Hermes said about himself. Apollo was not amused. Apollo said he was looking for his stolen cattle. And Hermes first denied it blatantly, flagrantly. "Oh, how could I steal cattle? I did not steal any cattle. Oh." But Apollo pressed his case, and eventually Hermes began to explain himself in a most beguiling way. "Oh, brother Apollo." This made Apollo's ears perk up. "Brother? Oh, brother Apollo, yeah, I was out looking at this world, looking at this beautiful world, and I came upon a herd of cattle. I didn't know who they belonged to, but I kind of had an idea. I wanted to give them shoes. I wanted to see if the tracks that they would leave upon the ground would be different if I made shoes for them out of chunks of oak bark and strung together fibers of weeds and things. And, well, eventually they ended up back here. Oh, what can I say, brother Apollo? But I only sacrificed 2. Sacrificed? What? I only sacrificed 2 of the cattle, and I didn't eat any of the meat. No, instead I sacrificed the cattle to the 12 gods. When Hermes said he sacrificed the cattle to the 12 gods, seemed like a wheel turned in the mind of Apollo. Apollo said, 12 gods? There are not 12 gods. There are 11 Olympian gods. But Hermes said, well, there are 12 including me, elder brother Apollo. I made a sacrifice to myself, but I didn't eat any of it or anything like that. And so this was too much for Apollo. You could say was it an epiphany of Apollo to recognize that he had a new sibling, or was it an epiphany of Apollo to recognize that things were not as they seemed? What could Apollo do but gather up Hermes and lickety-split transport him, both of them, to Olympus, to the court of Zeus himself, where Apollo stated his case about his stolen cattle. And Hermes hemmed and hawed. The more Hermes hemmed and hawed, the more his father Zeus on his throne of judgment was charmed. Zeus was charmed more and more by this child of his that he knew was his, but he had not spoken to until this point in time. And eventually Hermes confessed his theft. Eventually Hermes described the sacrifice that he had made and the gracefulness with which he had carried out these actions. And Zeus was ever so charmed. And not only was Zeus charmed by this, but Apollo was beguiled. Apollo sort of forgot his wrath. I have often thought that it is because of what Hermes did in these times. What Hermes did in this situation, in this drama, or in this story, that brought about one more step in the long evolution of the god Apollo, from a willful and vengeful and punitive god to the eventual god who could put the words nothise autun, these are Greek words, who could write nothise autun over the threshold of his shrine at Delphi. I mean, once in the youth of Apollo, his impetuous and violent youth, he had slain a monster with his arrows at this very shrine, and then audaciously then had claimed the shrine for himself, the shrine at Delphi. And then times go on, the biographies of the gods go on, And eventually Apollo gives a human testimony, know thyself, gnothise otun, which translates as know thyself. And this is put over the threshold of the shrine at Delphi. Was Apollo's, his long journey had a foreground long before that. But when Apollo was listening to the explanations of his younger brother Hermes about all the things that he had done, and when Apollo decided that, and maybe also by the decree of Zeus, when it was decided that, well, okay, yes, Hermes stole the cattle, but let me go back and visit my younger brother. Let's go back and see about more things. Maybe he can give me maybe I can make his acquaintance in a certain sense. And Apollo and Hermes returned to Mount Selene in Arcadia, Mount Kylene in Arcadia. And Hermes stepped into the cave once more, and he reached into his bundle where he had been sleeping, and he took out that tortoise shell, strung now with perhaps 3 strings, or maybe 7 strings, or maybe 4 strings, and maybe 9 strings. Maybe 12. Or maybe it changes the number of strings from strum to strum. In the realm of Hermes, this could be possible. But at any rate, Hermes removed that musical instrument and he began to play for Apollo. He began to play a song which charmed Apollo. We need to go into that song. But I also need to tell you of something that is coming from a different conduit of the story. And I need to tell you that when we're considering the manner and the matter of Hermes, we've got to be aware of the concrete objective sources by which the story material has come to us. Now, when I mention the piles of stones, and when I mention it as the original abstract art, and when I speak of it as the way that travelers along the boundary areas, boundary territories of the roads of the world, this is the way that people communicated with other people that they would never see, and yet they would be able to communicate in this way by piling stones at crossroads. When I speak of this happening and the actual real possibility of abstract communication and the ways that piles of stones can inspire others who go along the same roads, when I tell you about this, I'm kind of like, and this is my way of nodding to the pre-Olympian and pre-Titanic, basically prehistoric or precognitive, totally unknown origins of Hermes as a certain kind of god of these specific peoples along this specific place who did not, in any complicated way, have any kind of theology, right? Of course not. But they did have a need to place stones and to place stones upon stones. But it wasn't for the purpose of constructing any utilitarian structure. It was instead a way to commemorate some experience that was significant somehow. It was this need that, in my mind at least, is the actual birth of Hermes. Because he's some kind of god of communication. And so, then from there, then I go into the story of Hermes, of his birth and his parentage and his thievery of Apollo's cattle, all in the morning of the first day of his life, and his clever explanations not only to Apollo, but also to his father Zeus. And these clever explanations gave rise to the designated realms, domains, and functions of Hermes. He became a god of communication, a god of music, a god of herders, certainly a god of roads, a god of half-truths, a god of oaths, a god of treaties, a god of negotiations, a god of bargaining, a god of agreements, a god of trickery, and yes, also a god of thievery, all the complicated domains and functions of the gods. Well, this is a suggestion of how it can, how it begins to be so complicated in this way, because it is along these nexi, or these junctures of possible interpretation and understanding that these significant events occur, which we can only remember and then contemplate and ponder in our hearts and try to understand the implications of them. And this is the domain of myth. The painter has the paint, and the poet has the myth. We are mixing paints here, you might say. We are mixing paints based upon other paintings that have been made, but more importantly than that, as far as our own inner consciousness is concerned, our own seeing of those previous illustrations, and which contributes to the thing that we're trying to explore now, the poetic, the poetic influence of Hermes in our current and idiosyncratic lines of thought. Well, so there are those kind of origins of Hermes. Oh, yes. And so anyway, the story of Hermes then comes from a specific literary work. I do want to bring that in, the notion of a specific poem, a specific literary work, the Hymn to Hermes. Traditionally, the Hymn to Hermes, the source of our classical knowledge, the classical source of our knowledge of Hermes, the classical source of the story, that the elements of the story that I've so far conveyed to you, comes from the literary work called the Hymn to Hermes. But it leaves us with a lot of questions because it's a later composition. It is the persona of Hermes that is given to the classical age, and hence to our age now, because the classical age is the classical age, and our modern age or postmodern age or pre-postmodern or post-pre-modern or whatever you want to call it is just a line of succession, from the classical times and points long before that. And the information, the signposts, the crossroads take the form of masterpieces of literature, which we draw from to interpret our own experience. And so I have drawn from the Hymn to Hermes. And I have alluded to the piles of stones by the roads of the pre-literate times, and the dark beginnings, the obscure stirrings of what was later to become like a classical characterization, which would be the god that we call Hermes, which comes to us through the works of the literature. But for Hermes, there's another element that we have to consider that comes actually a little bit before the Homeric Hymn to Hermes. And these are the works of Homer and Hesiod. The works of Homer are the Iliad and the Odyssey. The works of Hesiod are the Theogony and Nights and Days. And these are where we see previous mentionings of Hermes and the functions of Hermes and what Hermes does. And I just want to see if I can bring forward an understanding of what can appear to us when we consider the works of Homer and Hesiod as those who have depicted the world of Hermes for us. And there's not much mention of Hermes. There's a little bit mention of Hermes mentioned in the Iliad. There's much more mention of Hermes in the Odyssey. There's kind of a generalized reason for that it might be worthwhile to look at. The world of the Iliad is a heroic world where the lifespan is the expression of the destiny of the heroic figure, be it Hector, Priam, Achilles, and Menelaus, and all of the others. And the lifespans are the death is glorious and final and memorable and is as it is. These are like simple and savage perceptions, crackling with sunlight and the scent of the seashore and the twang of the sword and the arrow and the clanging of the sword and the twang of the arrow and the clashing of the shields and all of this. It's a heroic world, and it can be seen in so many ways and satirized and all of this, but it works on a certain kind of level. And no matter where we take it or what we do with it, accept it, reject it, or whatever, it is always something that is as basic to our imaginations as the rain is basic to the ground that receives it. And Hermes is there. Hermes appears as, strangely enough, another open area of his functioning. In the world, the heroic world of the Iliad, Hermes appears as the psychopomp. Or does he? As the guide of the souls. Or does he? Is he the guide of the souls? Or is he doing something else, actually? I think in the Iliad, we can, for some reason, it might make sense to delineate a different kind of facet of who Hermes is. Because isn't it true? Doesn't Hermes appear to Priam when Priam wants to retrieve the body of his son from the clutches of the Greeks? Doesn't Hermes appear to Priam in the form of a human being who first befriends him and then at a certain point kind of leads him or guides him outside of the castle toward the lines of the Greeks, where he has to cross some lines and get past some sentries, and at some certain point, doesn't Hermes give Priam the gift of invisibility? Is it like that? Or am I making this up? I don't think I'm making it up. I could be misdirecting it in a certain sense for reasons of my own, but that would be perfectly in keeping with the spirit of Hermes. So maybe we should check into our Iliad about this. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you that Hermes gave the gift of invisibility to Priam, enabling him to spirit away the body of his son so that the proper funeral obsequies could be carried out. So this is what Hermes does. The gift of invisibility. The gift of traversing the boundaries. We know he is a god of boundaries. We know he is a god of roads. We know he is a god of explanations and of illuminating openings into what previously is just a highly constricted kind of perceptual understanding of things. So the poet Homer gives us another sense of a way to see the character and the doings and the actions of Hermes. Now, so that being said, let's consider just the world of the Odyssey. The Odyssey is a much more, the boundaries of the world of the Odyssey is much more of a fluctuating thing. It's not so much of kind of a heroic kind of, epic kind of book in that sense. The Odyssey is a world of many different cultures and places and visits. It's the story of a journey. It is the story of a journey. The journey of Odysseus, of course, Odyssey, which means in a certain sense journey. Oh, and because of this, it is perfect for a Hermetic interpretation. Because we know by now, or at least we can draw from the suggestions, that Hermes is a god of journeys. And so Odysseus is on this journey in all these different places. We could go into this on and on and on, of course. But what can we draw from it just in the most immediate sense? Hermes shows a different... Hermes shows a different sense of himself in the world of the Odyssey, in a certain sense more personal, almost. Because isn't Odysseus himself, isn't he descended from Hermes? According to the genealogies of the heroes and the gods, it's the golden thread working its way into Jerusalem's wall. We cannot begin to contemplate the genealogies and the chronicles of the gods and the heroes and all the others without seeing all the intricate ways that the gods interact with human beings. And these original interactions seem to have further and further manifestations down through the generations for us to interpret, which we are interpreting by what Hermes has offered for us. Now, so Odysseus is descended from Hermes. Odysseus' maternal grandfather is Autolycus. Can't go into everything that Autolycus did, but Autolycus was a great thief. And Autolycus was given the ability to thieve as a gift of the god Hermes. And Autolycus committed a great many thieving type things. Autolycus was very, very versatile. Some of the epithets of Odysseus recollect some of the magical powers. What were magical powers of thievery in Autolycus were, for Odysseus, versatility, ingenuity, resourcefulness. So in a certain sense, the divine gift has come down through successions of human form to reveal itself in a certain kind of like techne kind of way, or a certain type of way of skillfulness and opportunism and things of this nature. But all the inheritance of Hermes. But one other thing, though, about Hermes in the Odyssey, the way that he appears. He appears to Odysseus. He appears to Odysseus more than once, but he appears to Odysseus a certain time to provide him with some practical understanding of a certain kind of herb called moly, M-O-L-Y, which he can take in order to be free of certain spells which have held him in thrall. But it seems that Hermes appears to Odysseus as like kind of a commonplace thing. Like Hermes is saying, yeah, I'm from the other world. Yeah, I'm Hermes, but you may be familiar with me in a great many ways. I'm going to give you a familiar remedy for something. Here is a plant of the earth. You can use this to free yourself of the spells of enchantment. And then he's gone. He gives his message, a god of messages, appearing to Odysseus, a human being, to give a message. In the same way that Hermes functions to the gods as a messenger, as a herald, he appears. This is what Homer could see. He knew the gods as gods, and he knew their stories, but he was also so generous, and we are so grateful to Homer for giving us image after image and story after story of the way that the gods appear to human beings in the midst of their travail, in the midst of their adventures, in the midst of their circumstances, as if it was simply a part of the way nature works. So this is the Hermes in the Odyssey. This is the Hermes in the Iliad, as I mentioned and I've touched upon a bit. This is the Hermes in the hymn to Hermes. So why do I mention that? Because there's a larger theme here, and that is this theme of gods and what is a god, what constitutes a god, what happens when a human being is seeing a god. But even more than that, what is happening now in our consciousnesses, you and I, O poets, when we, in our questing imagination, ask ourselves with great sincerity, what does it mean to see a god? What is that epiphany? What is that theophany? What is that emergence? What is that revelation? What is that which comes out of hiding from the obscurity of our minds and our imagination? What leap of imagination do we take to see the world of a god as a god appears to us when we read, drawing out of our own interest, the ways that the world of the books can nourish our imaginations now, which are so wild and free. What is the way in which these gods can appear to us in a way that we can understand them creatively? Because creativity is the essence of the gods, each of the gods in their own particular way. So we have as examples the works of the poets in the literary works, and we see the ways that Hermes appears. And then we speculate upon the nature of Hermes, and an aid to speculation upon the nature of Hermes is the basic stories of Hermes, a little bit of which that I am relating to you now. And these are also signs and ways that we can begin to understand, the ways of the gods. Yes. And but there's something more with Hermes that is given to us directly out of the very nature of the questions that we're asking ourselves now. And that is, what science is it that we draw meaning? What is the archaeology, the psychic archaeology, science in the nature of it being a psychic archaeology that we are guided by the principles as we've learned them, as we work to draw meaning from these evidences that appear to us in the masterpieces of literature, and yet we are left with, what sense does that really make to us in our daily momentary lives right now? Well, could it be this? Let us put ourselves in the position of Hermes when he's assisting Apollo's tutors, the Theae, who taught Apollo the science of divining by following the tracks of pebbles as they sank through vessels full of clear water. And Apollo, by the way, told Hermes, as Apollo and Hermes exchanged many gifts. I don't need to go into the specifics of that, but the gift of warm water. Yeah, and that reminds me of something I also need to mention. Apollo and Hermes exchanged many gifts as they got to understand each other. And Hermes asked Apollo for the gift of prophecy. And Apollo, perhaps one further step on Apollo's journey toward divine humility, Apollo said, the gift of prophecy, that is not mine to give you, younger brother. The gift of prophecy was given to me by the Theae, the three sisters in the mountains. They're the ones who taught me that strange art. If you go to them, they can teach you. But from me, God to God, it is not mine to give. You would have to go to those who originally gave it to me, a God. Those who gave the gift before I was there, who learned it before I was there and gave it to me. You have to go to them. You have to, in other words, Apollo said this to Hermes, you have to go to a more primordial source than me, a God, to learn the skill of prophecy. So this sets up a commerce between different dimensions. And it's Hermes is the one who goes there to learn that. And it's Hermes who does learn that. And so then it is Hermes who provides this kind of like example, this living example for us as a way to move between the dimensions, not only of the gods and the humans, but those who came before the gods. And perhaps, dare I say it, those who come after the gods. And what could that be? What comes after the gods? Silence. But then again, silence too speaks, and it is Hermes is the one who could bring that forth. So, but now there's other. It is also told that Hermes sang a song before he stole Apollo's cattle. Hermes sang a song from the very moment that he made the musical instrument out of the shell of the turtle. It is said that Hermes sang a song of his own birth, but he sang the song with broad and crude terms. It is said that Hermes, before he knew how to sing, before his elder brother Apollo taught him the science of harmonies and musical scales and all this, Hermes had the raw instrument that he had invented out of the materials at hand. Pure inventiveness motivated Hermes to sing this song. So we begin to touch on the shamelessness of the gods here. We begin to touch upon the shamelessness of Hermes, who is supposedly saying this crude and off-key and screeching and adolescent and perhaps utterly vulgar story of the romance of his mother and father, of Zeus and of Maia, before he even knew how to make sounds out of this instrument. But he was making sounds out of this instrument. And it was, unharmonious? Was it the suggestion of music emerging from primeval chaos? But he sang a song of his mother, Maia, and his father, Zeus. And he didn't write of Maia the nymph living, he didn't sing of Maia the nymph as living in a cave. He spoke of a palace. He spoke of riches. Specifically, he spoke of tripods and of braziers. He spoke of these things in the palace of his mother Maia. He seems to have mentioned Maia's shoes, which captivated Zeus, who visited in the night. He seemed to talk about all of these things in this screeching song, vulgar and shameless, and yet it gives us one more element upon our own personal harpsichord to consider the way that things are. And then he went on his escapade and stole the cattle and met Apollo and all of that. And then he sang a second song. So the thing is that I want to mention, it's the second song that Hermes sang to his elder brother Apollo once he had made his instrument. And for some reason, perhaps by the breath of Apollo or Apollo's beneficial attention, Hermes was able to draw the plectrum across the strings of his tortoise-shell lyre and make more harmonious sounds. And Hermes then, for Apollo, sang a different kind of song. Hermes sang this different kind of song while Apollo was accompanying him to the place where Hermes had hidden the cattle that he stole from Apollo after they met with Zeus. Hermes said, elder brother Apollo, allow me to show you what use I have made of the instrument that I invented. And he began to sing this song, and he sang a song of the gods. Now, conventionally, it could be told that he sang a song of the gods in praise of Apollo, and that Apollo was so charmed that he continued to make these further bargains with Hermes, this further commerce of exchange, of mutual and beneficial self-interest, because of the way that Hermes charmed Apollo, because he's charming that way. That's part of Hermes' nature. But I want to emphasize for you that the first divine being that Hermes spoke of or sang of on the musical instrument that he himself first invented was not an Olympian god, certainly not his elder brother Apollo. He sang first to Mnemosyne. I have to pronounce her name, Mnemosyne, the mother of the muses. The first lyric that Hermes sang on his tortoise-shell lyre, accompanied by Apollo, to the place where Hermes had hid the stolen cattle of Apollo, even before Hermes gave the lyre to Apollo in exchange for some of Apollo's domains as a god. Even before that, Hermes was singing this song. And the first invocation was to Mnemosyne, the mother of the muses. And the very word, no matter how it's pronounced, means memory. Hermes sang a song to memory. Hermes sang a song to memory, the mother of the muses. Hermes sang it to Apollo on their way to the stolen cattle that Hermes hid. You can't make that stuff up. And he sang that song. And what is memory? Who is Mnemosyne? It is the living ground of the self-understanding of the soul in its very being. Mnemosyne is the water of that spring, and the soul is the clay, and it is Mnemosyne, the mother of the muses, who moistens that clay into a shape that can be the foundation of a fructified and renewed world. And it is Hermes who sang that song, invoking Mnemosyne. But he went on from there. Oh, I guess it's a family connection. After that, then he went on to talk about all the different gods, and he went on to talk about and to sing to Apollo and to flatter Apollo. And then they came to the fields of cattle, and they made this gift exchange. And Hermes became the god of herds and the god of shepherds. And the gods of those human beings, the god, I should say, of those human beings whose work it is to build kind of a mediating structure between their herds and their sheep or their cattle, between that and the environment in which they live, and to protect them and to guide them, and also to kind of communicate to them. So Hermes is the god of communication between all the different realms. The subtle one, Hermes is. Okay, now, well, we've touched upon a little bit. I know that the time has gone by. I have a desire to relate to you a specific poem that is kind of a hermetic poem. It is something that that partakes of the indirect communication that is the domain of Hermes, but not only just the indirect communication, but that extra little twist that makes it into something useful and tangible to you now, even though you can't quite put your finger on what it is exactly. Transmutations of the murky rulers. Deep within the backwoods live the murky rulers, who throw knives into trees and play gambling games, reassembling one skeleton from the bones of many persons, waiting for the breath of Dr. Frankenstein to change stones into bread. The butter below their hats begins to melt. Their heels become greasy. Their dogs begin to lick their lips. The bridge back home is as thin as the edge of the 10 of swords. The way to get there blends with what is not there, and where they stand is yellow with the sun. A blade of very strong magic cuts the moon a new place in the dark. The velvet night is a secret treasure chest, where the heartbeats of cats make the purple thistles dance as if they were giving birth to butterflies. They are, in a way. For the thistles are spiked palaces where old men draw horns in their reflections in the mirrors, and nestle their bones in threadbare animal skins, and sleep in piles of abandoned tires, living on mineral water and ketchup crackers, which they break silently and hand them over to each other in stacks of 3, trying not to laugh when one of them drops one, for they are thousands of years old, and have been that old for thousands of years, even as they age backward. 10 decades younger they grow every 10 centuries. The oldest one among them brings the caviar, which they flavor with mustard and eat from the center of tractor tires. Their tears of laughter make oceans, for their jokes are impossible to experience. Like a wind, that does not blow the same way, even once. So it is Hermes that allows poems like this to be written. I have endeavored to give you a way or an idea of a place to conceive it in your mind of how such things could be. I am learning it myself, making it up as I go along in a certain sense. Nevertheless, I honor all the gods in what they are and the God beyond them. Anyway, so it's time for me to draw this to a close. I must thank you for your heroic listening, and I so appreciate that you bear with me as I attend to the things that I want so much to tell you. I'm so glad that you stay with me through all this. Anyway, I thank you, and may it be for the enrichment and inspiration of all of us. So long for now.